Again, good morning, everyone, and very welcome. My name is Ümit Seven. I am moderating today's 60 minutes public seminar on technology and ethics in humanitarian action, hosted by the Humanitarian and Conflict Response Institute at the University of Manchester. Thank you again for all joining us online. This seminar series examines the expanding role of digital technologies in humanitarian action, from satellite imagery to predictive analytics to artificial intelligence. These innovations can offer significant advantages for humanitarian response, yet they also create new ethical and operational challenges. And as Kristoffer's most recent work reminds us, the ethical stakes of digitalization in humanitarian action are higher than in most other settings, given that the work involves some of the world's most vulnerable people. This tension between technological promise and ethical responsibility sits at the heart of today's discussion. Before we begin, let me note that we will have a Q&A after both presentations. Please feel free to submit your question through Q&A box at any time. I will gather them and put them in the discussion at the end of the presentation. Now, our first speaker is Dr. Corinne Bara. She is a senior lecturer at the Center for Secret Studies at ETH Zurich. Corinne uses computational methods to study various aspects of armed conflict and political violence. Today, she is going to present her work on early detection of humanitarian crises using satellite nighttime night data. This approach offers a powerful way to observe economic disruption, population movement, and the onset of crisis in places where this direct reporting may be limited or politically constrained. Corinne, thank you so much again for being with us. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Ümit. Let me just find the presentation again. So, while that is setting up. We're getting there, yes. Well, once again, thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here. I've always really admired the work being done at this center. And yeah, today I'll talk about one of my projects, which we started a bit less than a year ago, and in which we tried the early detection of humanitarian crises using satellite nighttime light. Can you see the slides? Yes, wonderful. Okay. The project is a so-called Humanitarian Action Challenge, and it's called like that because this is a research grant from ETH Zurich for research teams who partner up with a partner from the ICRC, or in the meantime also other humanitarian organizations, to try to support them in solving any of the challenges that they are facing in their work. And in this case, the challenge that we are trying to tackle is the early identification and monitoring of humanitarian crises, and that is in the context of armed violence, which is the context that our partner, the ICRC, works in. The ICRC, and that is really Tao's job, whom you see here on the picture. She's our partner locally at the ICRC. The ICRC is constantly monitoring areas of concern for them, both with its staff on the ground, but also at headquarters, using whatever data they can get their hands on, including satellite data. But this is all manual and very time-consuming work in a team that is already quite small. And because of that, a lot of the analysis inevitably has to focus on areas where the ICRC already has an idea that something is going on, right? So the solution that we are working on has the aim to detect crises or new developments early in places where we may not necessarily know that they are happening. An automatic early warning system for humanitarian crisis, so to say, that would then alert the ICRC if something seems out of the ordinary that would deserve their attention so that they can then take a closer look. And the project team consists of us conflict researchers at ETH Zurich and remote sensing scholars at the EPFL, which is kind of the French-speaking ETH in Switzerland, and our partners at the ICRC. And to develop this monitoring tool, we focus in this project only on one very specific type of satellite data, and that is nightlight data. And in a nutshell, this data just measures the brightness of light on Earth, or how much light there is in a particular area. And this light comes from various sources: street lights, building lights, traffic. Industry is a big light producer, especially greenhouses, but we could also see holidays, football events, and I found that very interesting, and I didn't know that even bioluminescence. On a map, the data looks like that, and I'm sure you have seen these beautiful pictures of Earth at night. This data, this satellite nightlight data, is not a new data source. It has been around for a long time, decades, in fact. There's also decades of research that shows that nighttime light, as measured from space, correlates very strongly with economic development. So this data has been used a lot as a proxy for development indicators, especially on the local level, where we often don't have this data, or where statistics are not very reliable. And on that note, I don't know whether you can see my mouse hovering over the picture you see here, and many of you might have seen this example. This is South Korea, and this is North Korea. So I think this example really drives home this point of nighttime light being a good proxy of economic development. Now, until a couple of years ago, this data was only available yearly. But in 2018, the American Space Agency, NASA, released this data daily, globally, and for free for everyone to use. And this really opened up entirely new possibilities to use this data for conflict monitoring. Because essentially, nightlight data captures the availability of energy and the use of energy by humans, and as such can be a good indicator of human livelihoods and human activity. And when armed conflict breaks out, and this is our logic here, right, breaks out or escalates, this will react. Human activity changes and the availability and use of energy changes. And there are several reasons for this. I've listed a couple here. The most obvious one is, of course, destruction of energy infrastructure, as happens or happened a lot in Ukraine, but also the destruction of civilian housing, industry, roads that will then not emit light anymore. There can be in conflict zones planned power outages to save energy, as also happened in Ukraine. Demographic changes when people flee or have died, then that changes the local energy demand, and we could probably see that curfews would restrict people's social and economic activities, especially in the evening when these pictures are taken. People or entire cities also try to dim lights at night to avoid becoming a target of bombardment. Fear loss trauma may keep people from going out and about. Loss of livelihoods means they would have to save energy. They don't go to the market as much. They don't go to restaurants. And also sometimes people cannot go to work because it's too insecure. Logistics chains are broken, and that would affect industrial operations, which would then affect nighttime light. So we think any and all of these mechanisms could change the availability or use of energy, and that we should be able to see that from space in the short term and pretty much in near real time. And in fact, we know that we can see this. And to show this, I have made a little animation for you using this daily data here from NASA of how the lights turn off around Kiev at the start of the Russian aggression in early 2022. And you just need to ignore the flickering. That is not of relevance. So let me see. Oh. Okay, that is interesting. You cannot see an animation, right?
No, we cannot see. We see only the map.
Okay, so this animation doesn't seem to be working in the live PowerPoint. That's no problem. You would see, if it were working, you would see how the lights start turning off. First, the streets the streets leading in and out of Kiev turn off, and then less and less light is seen in Kiev over a period of 3 months. But we can also look at this here. These are monthly statistics, not daily. And you see that in 3 regions of Ukraine, the nighttime light loss was massive at the start of the war, but not in Crimea, where nighttime light, for instance, doesn't deviate from the usual seasonal patterns. And if at all, we see an increase in light as a result of Russian military presence and installations. Now, the thing is, it is one thing to show this after the fact, right? When everyone knows something has happened. And it's quite a different thing to detect these changes when we have no idea something is happening somewhere. And especially when the changes are not as extreme as here in the Ukraine example. And the reason that this is challenging is the following. Daily nighttime light data is not neat. You see here a daily nighttime light series from 2012 to 2024 for a small town in Ukraine that is relatively representative of the type of towns we have in Ukraine, where light is not massive, but there is light, right? And what you see here is that this looks not like a neat time series, but more like an electrocardiogram, but even more unruly, I would say. This time series is seasonal. It has seasonal changes, which you cannot see very well because it's so compressed. It is affected by moonlight in rural areas. It's affected by satellite viewing angle in urban areas. And there are also huge daily fluctuations that may or may not have a good reason. Sometimes it's just really atmospheric conditions, particles in the air that influence the remote sensing measurement, or it could be a random power cut that is of no interest to anyone. Still, if you look here in the beginning of 22, I think you can kind of see the drop in nighttime light at the start of the war. But are we sure we would have detected or known that this is something out of the ordinary, given all the fluctuations that we already had before? And this is still an example where the drop is kind of visible to the human eye. In most other places, especially in more rural areas where light is less and varies even more, it's really hard to make these changes out by just looking at them. So what we are doing in this project is to train machine learning algorithms to learn what nighttime light would normally look like in a place. It would learn the normal time series. And on the basis of this learned pattern, it would constantly try to predict how light needs to look like normally in the next day, week, month. Like so. And I've made this by hand. And then at some point in time, when the predicted nighttime light and the nighttime light that we actually see starts to deviate substantially, we would flag an anomaly and issue a warning to the ICRC that they should take a closer look. The reason this is hand drawn now is because we're actually in the middle of this right now, and we haven't managed yet to produce a functioning, really good algorithm, especially not one that works sufficiently well across different places. And we have already worked on this quite a bit, so it shows this is a really challenging computational problem, but that's what this project is for, and that's what we're working on currently. But this algorithm, even though this is kind of one of the main things, it's not the only thing we want to deliver in this project. Given that this data source, at least in its new daily version, is not understood very well, we also want to understand a bit better. We also just want to understand this data a bit better in order to be able to tell the humanitarian community where the kind of promises and pitfalls lie, and in which contexts it can and should be used, and where it maybe shouldn't. So our second kind of challenge or task is to better understand what these changes in nighttime light that we see from space actually capture in terms of developments on the ground. And I've already said that researchers have long used the annual data for development, and that is because they have really good studies that show that it is a good proxy for economic development, where they have compared nighttime light with local economic statistics where available, or even surveys. But we really lack the same good understanding of what these faster changes, daily and weekly changes, capture. What type of changes in human behaviors and livelihood can be detected well, and which ones not? And of course, our ideal data to find that out would be something like local level weekly surveys of the same people in the same place again and again, that would ask them questions about their security situation, access to essential services, whether they can go to work or not. But that is, of course, completely unrealistic that we can do these surveys on a large scale. So instead, we will just, in this part of the project, we will just compare the nighttime light data to whatever other data we can get our hands on to better understand these changes. This will be other satellite data like optical imagery, which is what you usually see, like when you see satellite imagery in the news. The IOM has also said that they will share detailed migration statistics with us, against which we can compare the nightlight data. We will use existing surveys where available and case studies. And just to give you one example, this is a little case study that one of our research assistants has done for Haiti, where gang violence has massively increased in the last years. And it's an interesting example because we think this is the type of violence that we would not see in other satellite data, because this is not Ukraine, right? These gangs are not fighting, like they're not bombing buildings and destroying buildings with heavy weaponry, but this is street to street fighting, so we wouldn't see destruction in other satellite data really well. But people are abandoning, fleeing from entire areas of Port-au-Prince and moving to other areas and to IDP camps. And we think this is something that we should maybe see or detect in the nighttime light data. What you see here is a map by the IOM, where in red you have the areas that were most heavily affected by violence in last December in 24, and in blue are the areas where people have been fleeing to. And we can actually see this, and this is what our research assistant has done. We can see this change in the nighttime light data for all these red areas. This is one of them, Fort National. And what we see here is that normally, we have used 2017-18, normally around this time of the year, light increases because of the holidays, New Year, Christmas decorations, all these things. You see that in both years. But last year in 2024, just when that should have happened, that actually didn't, right? Instead, light just kept on dropping and becoming less as people were fleeing these areas, were afraid to move. Those that stayed were afraid to move around in the evenings. So this is just one example of the type of case studies that we will do here. And then finally, we really want to understand the limitations of this data. And I think this has a huge ethical aspect here. What can we detect, what not, of course, but also how locally can we detect crisis and how quickly can we detect changes? And probably the most important one, what are the limitations of this in rural and remote areas? And it's probably already on top of your minds that in order to detect drops in nighttime light, you need to have nighttime light to begin with. And we always knew this wasn't the case everywhere. We always knew that we won't be able to monitor large swaths of rural areas in many countries. I don't think we knew the extent of this problem. So we conducted a study published this year, in fact, where we combined the satellite nightlight data with very fine-grained population data to find out how many % of the world's population would get left out if we were to deploy this type of monitoring system. And what we found is that nearly a quarter of the global population and almost a third of those affected by violence or living in violence-affected areas, they actually live in areas without detectable nighttime light, which also partially means that, unfortunately, this data source is most tricky exactly where we would like to have it, because these are also the areas where we don't have other good data sources. And just one quick example here is Maung Da in Myanmar, where massive violence against the Rohingya people was perpetrated, for instance, in 2000. So this is from 2017. What you see here is a map by UNOSAT, the UN agency that provides satellite images during crisis. The red areas are houses and villages that were destroyed, burned, torched, bulldozed during that time. Now, nighttime light data in this case would have been extremely unhelpful, even if we would have exactly wanted it for this type of context. What you see is only in these little orange areas is there actually measurable nighttime light from space. Now, this is not something, Ümit, how am I with time? Do I have 2-3 minutes?
Yes, you have 3-4 minutes.
Yeah, great. Okay. Now, this lack of light is not something we can change, right? But we think time will change that. More people will have electricity in the future. But also one big reason that the coverage in the countryside is so bad that we are using a satellite that makes its overpass or takes its picture at 1:30 at night. And I have my lights off usually at 1:30 at nights, and especially people who use generators or solar power, as many people in developing countries, they have their lights off then, right, to save energy. But there are already satellites out there that do make measurements at other times, at times that capture more of human activity and human behavior. But at this point, they just cannot cover the whole globe yet. But for us, it still means, I think it's still a good time to explore the potential and limits of this data to get that algorithm working, because if at all, it will become more useful in the future and not less. Now, my final slide is, why do we use this particular data source at all? Why nighttime light data of all data sources that we could be using? The main reason is really that it is a bit different from other satellite imagery like optical or radar imagery because it can capture changes in human presence or behavior even if there is no physical destruction. All the other satellite data needs something to be destroyed to detect something, right? But nighttime light data is a bit different in that regard. And that is, I think, interesting for the humanitarian context. Also, many other satellite data don't take pictures daily. Nighttime, it's often weekly or bi-weekly, and that is if there's no cloud coverage. But we have this data daily. And as I already said, it's global, available for free in near real time. You could be using it right now if you wanted. And I think that makes it also attractive for humanitarian organizations. Then it captures a bit of many things, right, as you have seen. So it's a very broad measure of human activity, which can make it a disadvantage. So when the light changes, we don't quite know why. But it's also an advantage because humanitarian crises, they can take many forms and shapes depending on the context. So having a kind of data source that picks up a wider set of phenomena can also be an advantage. And a final point, and I hope this provides a little bit of a lead over to Kristoffer. It's not an extremely intrusive data source. We don't see with it, right? We don't see humans, we don't see vehicles or military installations, we just see light. And I think that also makes it interesting for humanitarians, where sometimes, for instance, when people flee for a reason, right, they may not want to be detected, so to say. So I think with this data source, there's also a bit less chance of misuse by government or military actors. But I'm really looking forward to hear what Kristoffer may have to say about this. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Corinne. As a former aid worker, I will say that this method is really very attractive, as you say. Now we will move to our second speaker, Dr. Kristoffer Lidén from the Peace Research Institute Oslo, known as PRIO. Kristoffer is a senior researcher at PRIO and the Norwegian Center for Humanitarian Studies. Lidén heads the PRIO research group on law and ethics. Kristoffer's recent article published in Disasters, Ethics and the Governance of Digital Data in Humanitarian Action. He examines the foundations and limitations of ethical self-regulation in humanitarian data governance. Kristoffer, thank you so much for being us. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I just posted a link to the article in the chat, and I wonder if you could all just check if that link works and go into the article and just glance quickly through, so that you get a sense of the article that I'm talking about. Would that be okay? And I'll tell you when you should return to the screen. So I'm now looking at my own version, and as you will see, it starts with an introduction. Then there's a discussion on problems of uses of digital data in humanitarian action. It's a very, very brief overview of some of the issues. And then it goes into ways of addressing those problems through ethical principles. And then next section is on ethical procedures for addressing the problems. If you continue downwards, it goes into problems with these two approaches, and finally discusses ways of addressing them under the heading of promises. Okay, so you may now return. Now you have an idea of what this looks like. By the way, Corinne, a wonderful presentation from you. Very, very concrete and convincing, and very balanced in terms of how you show the potential and also the limitations. And your point on the intrusiveness is speaking directly to my focus. So I could maybe start there. Let's think of another type of satellite data that was more intrusive. Data that shows, for instance, movements in rebel groups fighting for a democratic revolution in a very repressive regime. That information could be very relevant to humanitarians. It could also, just as you said, be abused by authorities or other armed groups. Security services, it could be used for punishment later as well. There's a very fundamental challenge in humanitarian action, a balance between considerations of efficiency and usually centralizing and sharing as much data as possible enhances the efficiency of operations. You really want organizations to cooperate both internally and between different agencies. And you, for instance, don't want to duplicate needs assessments and other types of data that are crucial for humanitarian operations, but that are quite work intensive and where joining forces is much better than that each agency would, for instance, develop their own data sets on everything. On the other hand, there's the concern of data protection and potential abuses, as well as the quality of the data and how the uses of digital data transforms the very nature of humanitarian action. So if you think about this example of satellite imagery, there's a question of, let's say that nighttime lightning was combined with a whole set of other information, like the maps that you showed in your example, Corinne. This was shared widely. If it was then accessed by security services, could it then be misused in some way? These are things that agencies are aware of, that they need to think through. They need to have principles and routines for making these decisions. And the decisions are usually very difficult between these concerns for efficiency, truly about, saving lives on the one hand, and protecting data subjects on the other. So I'm in my study, I have looked at uses of digital data across a wide variety of technologies, and it does include, the field of artificial intelligence. Usually these days, an article like this would concentrate on AI, ethics of AI, and how to regulate that field. But this is using the management of digital data as an entry point into this wider field of digital technologies in humanitarian action. Okay, so I was part of a project that looked into new digital technologies and the ethical issues that they brought up. And my initial job was supposed to be to draw out lessons and come up with a better analysis based on my philosophical background of the ethical problems of digital technology in humanitarian action. But every time I discussed this with other scholars, in particular lawyers, but also practitioners, they would confront me with the question of ethics washing. They would express severe frustrations with the ability of humanitarian aid organizations to truly manage their uses of data and make the right decisions in this respect. So they thought that maybe it's a waste of time to further improve the ethical principles, come up with better procedures for self-regulation, when what you really need is some sort of hard regulation and external oversight and control, as well as influence, political influence from the communities that will be affected by these technologies. So the general kind of message was, let's make it a legal question, let's make it a political question, and let's not dwell on this kind of question of ethics, because that just allows organizations to keep on applying these technologies in ways that might be problematic and where they are not truly accountable for their decisions in this respect. So this resembles the debates on ethics washing and ethics shopping and so on in big tech that you may be familiar with. So I have a few slides I can just show you for illustration, but what I really do is to invite you to a philosophical reflection on this question of ethics washing and humanitarian action. So I will discuss a concrete guidance, but I use it as an example for a philosophical analysis. So it's not really an empirical study. So let's see, we can go with this slide here, and I'll open this as presenter. Okay, so here you just see some of the most prominent examples of ethics guidance that has been produced in this domain. One central contribution is the ICRC Handbook on Data Protection and Humanitarian Action. It came in a second edition in 2020, late 21. You see it up here, and that is really a marvelous overview of the concerns that come into this field, and highly recommended. But there are also lots of other reports, guidances, and so on that take various approaches, start from different types of principles and perspectives, and altogether they form a very solid basis for thinking about the ethical self-regulation of in this field. But still, there is this very limited trust in that the presence of these documents, these guidances, and so on, this knowledge will really trickle into organizations and the decisions that they make. So I thought, okay, what is the most kind of state-of-the-art comprehensive guidance in this field that exists, and will that version of an ethics guidance be able to somehow address those concerns? So I identified this operational guidance on data responsibility in humanitarian action from the Interagency Standing Committee. It's the highest UN body organizing, coordinating humanitarian action, and it also includes non-UN agencies. It's the result of work done by leading experts across lots of different organizations, and it was the outcome of a process where they first published one version into 2021, I think. Then they rolled it out, they had consultations and so on. This 23 version is then an update of that based on input from the sector. So I would say that at present, this is a good starting point for a critical reflection on the potential for really regulating and self-regulating this from an ethics perspective. So agencies can commit to follow this, but it's not a compliance document that they will be punished for not following. So it's based on the commitment of agencies to do so themselves. In the article, I go through the principles and procedures that this guidance is proposing. And to put it simply, it starts out with a set of principles. And these principles are a combination of very kind of operational principles, safety of data protection standards, and so on, and more ethical, philosophical questions like legitimacy, proportionality, a human rights-based approach, and so on. So while there is a certain kind of joint understanding of some of them, and some of them are more technical, others are rather philosophical. And what I argue is that the challenge with these principles is that there is not really a consensus on how to understand and operationalize at least the more philosophical principles that are listed there. And then you might say, okay, but that's not necessarily such a big problem if the more technical principles are at least adhered to. And that's partly right. On the other hand, a technological solution that adheres to, you know, the highest standards of safety and data protection might still be highly problematic. It might not be legitimate in the eyes of the communities that are affected. It might not be proportionate, and so on. So actually, in order for the purpose of those principles as they are formulated in this guidance to really be realized, one would need also to live up to the standards of the more philosophical ones. So what I then suggest is that this is not a fundamental problem. It just means that agencies need to be aware that there is no clear consensus, there is no clear answer to how these principles are to be understood, but they actually serve a very good starting point for critical debate, deliberation, disagreement, contestation on how those principles are to be understood and applied. And this is exactly the kind of process that one needs to go through in order to raise awareness. So I'm not saying that the lack of a consensus on these questions means that the guidance is completely flawed. It just means that one should not expect it to automatically result in ethical decision making. And this is how it would often be understood, and also partly the reason why there would be this dynamic where the presence of these such guidance could be used as an argument for not needing close regulation and external control and political engagement and so on. So the second part of the guidance, and I'll actually just stop sharing now. Yep. No, I have one slide to show you. Anyway, the second part is going into procedures for regulation. And those procedures distinguish between three different levels. So the whole systemic level of humanitarian action, then a cluster level, and we're not talking about a specific response context like Gaza or Ukraine or Sudan. So the systemic level, all agencies and how they use and share data, then the cluster level, and then the level of the individual organization. And this plays into existing procedures and ways of operating, so it seems to make a lot of sense. Then there are a whole set of mechanisms that are supposed to be followed and combined in order to actually meet the principles in practice. And these, again, all make sense. The question is whether agencies will truly be sufficiently committed and competent and coordinated to implement these procedures in practice and in a way that really prevents the type of ethics washing that one is concerned with when you have procedures in place, but they are not necessarily followed. And in the article, I discuss, based on lots of interviews and conversations with practitioners, I discuss some of the shortcomings or the challenges to implementing these procedures, and you can see the arguments there. And lastly, what I do then argue is that this sets humanitarian agencies up not necessarily for wittingly using ethics guidance for ethics washing, but they have a very strong commitment and reason to adopt these ethical principles without necessarily having the capacity to fulfill them, which leads to what I call ethics failure rather than necessarily conscious ethics washing or ethics shopping and so on. So it's something I then relate to a recent concept of humanitarian ignorance, and see this as a challenge that needs to be addressed. And I argue that the solution is not to stop trying to go for ethical self-regulation in humanitarian action. You cannot replace ethical self-regulation with legal oversight and political control. That's not realistic that you will solve the problem in that way. You need an element of self-regulation, but you need the right balance between the three, and you need to address the shortcomings also of the procedures, this kind of guidance document. And one of the key shortcomings of this guidance document is the lack of a third-party oversight mechanism that could look into the ability of different agencies to actually comply with this. So I discuss some alternatives for thinking of how that could be set up in the end of the article. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for this thought-provoking presentation, Kristoffer. There is a lot in what you have just presented that cuts right to the core of the current humanitarian practice. Your points about self-regulation, the risk of ethics version, I believe that it strongly resonates with the ongoing debates across the sector. And frankly, it's also related to practical dilemmas many of us see in these real operations. Now we will open the floor for questions, as I highlighted. So you can use Q&A box, or you can just raise your hands and ask any questions. Comments are very welcomed. So let's take a moment to see what comes in. There is no question, but then I will use my privileged role as the chair. So I will ask two questions, one for Corinne and the other one, Kristoffer. Corinne, at least I will say that based on my own research, this was the case in Syria, Ethiopia. Sometimes governments deliberately cut off electricity power. So how do you, I would like to understand, how do you distinguish between those deliberate deprivation of electricity and those some sort of damage to infrastructure or population flight? So do you capture these kind of spikes as well in your method? And so I will also directly ask my question to Kristoffer. Kristoffer, Interagency Standing Committee is a platform that brings both UN organization, but also non-UN organization as well. ICRC, for instance, it's part of it. So you say that there is no normative consensus. I think because of its nature, don't you think that this is normal to have not a normative consensus because of the diversity? But related to this one, so you say that there should be some sort of deliberation process. There should be some sort of space that gives voices to different participants as well. So in your opinion, what would a genuinely decolonial or locally grounded deliberative process look like in humanitarian data governance? So we can start with the Corinne.
Thank you. My micro is back on, right?
Yes.
Yeah, good. Thanks a lot, Ümit. Yeah, this is an extremely interesting point, and Syria and Ethiopia are perfect examples for this deliberate cutting off of electricity. Generally, I think it's not going to be easy to generally distinguish the source of light change, right? But now in this specific case, I would expect that we would still see a bit of different pattern. These, the examples that you mentioned, that would last over a longer time, right? That's not a messy sudden drop or something. It would last over a longer time. It would affect a very particular area. From that, you could possibly also tell what is going on. We will try in our project to look at different, what we call signatures. Do different types of crises produce different signatures of change in nighttime light? But I don't think this is going to be easy. But I think it's just also an example where this is a data source that could also bring conflict research forward a lot, because you have just raised a topic that, I don't know, I've not seen this talked about a lot in conflict research, and this data source would possibly be a way to explore this type of light cutoff as counterinsurgency or repression, right? It's very relevant.
Yeah,
thanks a lot. Please go ahead, Kristoffer.
Yeah, thanks. So in terms of deliberation, it's absolutely natural that agencies have different understandings, but there is in the literature and in these guidances a certain expectation of a coherence or an agreement. It plays on the the concept of ethical, as if there's one way of being ethical, or following ethics leads to being ethical, in a sense that does not recognize this inherent pluralism or diversity in ethical opinions that is very familiar, in the field of moral philosophy or ethics. So often there is also some, in amongst philosophers, this whole kind of discourse of ethics, ethical regulation, and so on, is often ridiculed, or even something that they don't want to touch, because of these ways of not really kind of adhering to or recognizing that concepts like legitimacy and human rights based and so on will just point towards a wide variety of different understandings. This also speaks to the challenge of a decolonial perspective, and taking the perspectives of affected communities into account. The diversity of culture and digital cultures is truly a challenge. But it's also the fact that these practices already are happening across different cultures. It's not going to be perfect. So the idea that you would in some way truly represent the culture and the values of local communities in this sense as a premise for carrying out humanitarian operations could also be exaggerated. There is a tension between, modern society and a decolonial or pluriversal perspective on politics already. So it also depends on where you want to put the bar for a humanitarian agency versus other technological developments in the society where they operate. So that's a challenge. I'll post in the chat a link to a very good report on Foresight and decolonial perspectives on digital data in this respect. Kristin Sandvik, my colleague in the project and who led the research project, together with Larissa Fast, who was their colleague in that project. By the way, I see you've raised your hand. Kristin has done a study on efforts at community-based ethical approaches, and also how this becomes more challenging the more local and genuinely kind of community-based you get, because then you get, also tensions between different groups. You empower some, it affects others. How do you do that in practice? That's really a challenge to be taken into account. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Kristoffer. Larissa has a question. Please go ahead, Larissa.
Yeah, I thought I would just go on camera. It's really good to see you both, Corinne and Kristoffer. Just also to say that a number of us at HCRI have had a project on local research ethics, which gets at many of the same sort of topics that you've just raised in your answer and also the article that you published. So I'm going to ask a question that goes to both of you in different ways. I think the use of nighttime lights is a really potentially exciting development for all the reasons that Corinne already identified. But it strikes me it also plays into one of the critiques of humanitarianism and the use of data, which is that we're becoming yet more and more remote from the populations that we're aiming to serve. And here is sort of in many ways an extreme example of using that sort of remote data source to actually respond to humanitarian action. So I think from both an operational but also an ethical perspective, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that from both, actually. Thanks. And thanks for your presentations. Really wonderful to hear what you're working on.
Thanks a lot, Larissa, and it's very good to see you here. Yeah, I completely agree with you with the tendency to become more and more remote. I myself, I'm not a humanitarian worker, I don't know, but what I see is that I think it would be an illusion to think that this whole remote monitoring will ever be enough, right? I always think, and especially with the data that we use, it can be a warning flag, an indication, but it can never, we just can never know enough. And maybe that's good. So it will never replace the ICRC's people on the ground and an engagement with the people they serve. That's just a bit how I think about that.
Yeah, so along those lines, I could mention the book by Fleur Johns, Help, #Help, that I also use in my article, where she emphasizes how digital technologies do change who the actors are involved, and when if one relies on commercial services, for instance, they become part of the ecosystem of humanitarian action, and one would need to somehow adhere to their priorities as well. And that's to a large extent the case also currently when humanitarian agencies go from in the initial phase of digital technology to kind of come up with their own systems to really collaborate closely with large big tech companies for efficient solutions. Sometimes those companies, they really rely on having systems in place for data protection and so on, but then other problems come with that. When it comes to this idea of relying on one issue like nighttime lighting and satellite data, my experience is that these discussions, when it comes to the ethical implications of them, often have the fundamental flaw that they isolate the particular technology and then discuss that in isolation. And you did allude to how this would be combined with other types of data information sources. And it's in this combination that you really find kind of the future nature of the individual technologies that we're talking about. And it's extremely challenging to foresee how these data will play into larger sets of data and how they can be analyzed in new ways in the future with more and more advanced AI. So I think the AI debates, even if they could in various ways be reflecting a certain hype, it's still very essential when we think about the ethics of data and data responsibility to take future scenarios of how those data can be analyzed and used, for instance, for protection through ever more advanced technology, quantum computers, and so on. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Kristoffer. We have last final question to Corinne. One of our participants asked a specific question related to which humanitarian organization uses these nighttime data other than the ICRC. Do you know that? Are there some other humanitarian agencies that rely on nighttime data to identify humanitarian crisis, Corinne?
No, I'm not aware of anyone. I mean, even the ICRC is not yet using it, right? It's not yet at the state where they can use it. No, there is one organization. One sec. Oh, can't find the report. There is one other organization, and I can look it up afterwards, that has started looking into. And I know that organization, I think Amnesty International occasionally relies on it for spot checking something, but not in a larger scale monitoring sense now.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot again. Now we'll close the session. I really want to thank you to both Corinne and Kristoffer for those very nice thought-provoking presentation. I also want to thank Andre for supporting this webinar. Of course, I also want to thank all of our participants, the questions, the comments, they really helped deepen the conversation. So this seminar is part of the wider series here at the Humanitarian and Conflict Response Institute. We hope you will join us again as we continue exploring these themes that sit right at the intersection of practice, ethics, and research. Thanks again. I wish you a good afternoon.
Thanks, Ümit. Thanks a lot.
And
Bye, everyone.
Thanks so much for
here.
organizing and for listening. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.